Boa noite. A partir desse momento, você está assistindo ao Espaço Público aqui na TV Brasil. No programa de hoje, nós exibimos uma entrevista gravada com Angela Daivis, a principal liderança feminina da luta pelos direitos civis nos Estados Unidos. Movimento que fez heróis e mártires e inspirou mudanças no mundo inteiro, inclusive no Brasil. Para participar dessa entrevista, convidamos a jornalista Juliana César Nunes, da empresa Brasil de Comunicação. Contamos, como sempre, com a participação de Florescer Fernandes aqui do meu lado. Eu sou Paulo Moreira Leite, apresentador e âncora do Espaço Público. Boa noite, Angela Daivis.
Boa noite.
Eu estava nos Estados Unidos quando Barack Obama foi eleito presidente. Eu vi de perto a empolgação dos eleitores, não apenas negros, com a vitória. Hoje, Obama é um presidente bastante impopular. Você está decepcionada com ele? Você sente orgulho, apesar de tudo? Como é que é isso?
Well, of course, the election of Barack Obama was a world historical event. People all over the planet rejoiced when the first black president was elected in the U.S. Many people assumed that this meant that enormous and radical change was going to happen. But I think they forgot that he was the president of the United States of America, the racist, imperialist, capitalist United States of America. And so I think it was important that he was elected. And that moment was a moment of promise, because people all over the world felt connected in this aspiration for a better world. But electing one individual black man to the presidency of the United States of America cannot fulfill that promise. That promise still remains to be fulfilled.
Ok. Vamos ver agora uma reportagem sobre a história de Angela Daivis.
Num país onde a discriminação racial chegou a ser autorizada por lei, Angela Yvonne Daivis é o mais conhecido rosto feminino na luta pelos direitos da população negra. A cabeleira Black Power, que usou na juventude, tornou-se um símbolo universal de homens e mulheres engajados na luta contra o racismo. Nascida em 1944, no Alabama, estado com um histórico trágico de preconceito racial, de lá para cá, Angela Daivis acumulou meio século na defesa da igualdade e da democracia. Filha de um professor de ensino médio que era filiado ao Partido Comunista Americano, ela tinha 20 anos de idade quando se engajou na luta contra a repressão ao movimento negro, chegando a ser mantida sob vigilância permanente do FBI, a Polícia Federal norte-americana. Seu nome foi incluído na lista de 10 pessoas mais perigosas do país. Angela Daivis chegou a ser presa por 16 meses, até que, graças a uma campanha internacional auxiliada por estrelas do rock como John Lennon e Mick Jagger, foi absolvida pela falsa acusação de ter contribuído para uma ação violenta da organização Panteras Negras. Aos 25 anos, Angela brigou na justiça para lecionar na Universidade de Berkeley, na Califórnia, enfrentando o então governador Ronald Reagan, para quem uma professora de ideias comunistas não tinha o direito de lecionar para a juventude daquele estado. Nas décadas seguintes, ela se engajou na defesa dos direitos das mulheres. Foi 2 vezes candidata a vice-presidente dos Estados Unidos pelo Partido Comunista, que jamais atraiu muitos eleitores. Durante uma campanha, quando um adversário fez insinuações sobre a vida pessoal, Angela Daivis declarou: "Sou lésbica". Há 3 anos, sua história foi lembrada no documentário Libertem Angela Daivis e Todos os Presos Políticos, dirigido por Shola Lynch. Nos últimos anos, Angela Daivis percorre a África, Europa, Caribe e América do Sul para debater as formas atuais do racismo e a perseguição à população negra, dedicando uma atenção especial às condições de encarceramento. Ela esteve em Brasília na semana passada, quando gravou a seguinte entrevista para o Espaço Público.
Angela, a visão que o Brasil ainda tem sobre você ainda é muito conectada, Angela, desse movimento Black Power da década de 70, quanto brasileiros faziam campanhas pela sua libertação e pela libertação de Mandela e, ao mesmo tempo, pensavam como libertar a Angela e o Mandela, que existiam entre nós, entre homens e mulheres negras. Hoje, que Ângela, que as pessoas, principalmente negras no Brasil, precisam pensar em libertar e deixar fluir nesse momento que tem outros desafios, alguns persistentes e outros novos?
Well, of course, the campaign to free me in 1970, 1971 was a very important moment. And I always point out that people recognize my name today, not so much because of what I've done, but because of what people did for me. And I will never forget that enormous movement of solidarity that affected people on almost all of the continents in the world. But of course, I was only one person. And even at that time, I recognized that there were many more political prisoners. And at that time, I came to recognize that the issue wasn't only the repression of political prisoners, but it was the racist and repressive function of the prison system. And so for the last decades, I have been doing work to free political prisoners, to challenge the prison industrial complex. And many of us who are involved in that anti-prison campaign refer to ourselves as abolitionists. That is to say, we are in favor of abolishing the prison, abolishing imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment.
Ângela, é um grande prazer poder entrevistá-la, um orgulho aqui para todos os jornalistas que trabalham aqui na TV Brasil. E eu gostaria de saber, você como uma líder negra que militou no Partido Comunista, que vê hoje o fim do comunismo no leste europeu, que vê um mundo globalizado sem a contrapartida de um sistema alternativo, você consegue ver a eliminação da desigualdade social, que é tão importante para acabar com o racismo, dentro do capitalismo?
Well, of course, it is important to hold on to the hope that we will be able to abolish racial injustice, economic inequality, and political repression. It is really wonderful to be here in Brazil. This is my 5th trip to Brazil. This time I was invited to participate in the festival Latinidades 2014. And I was asked to speak about Black feminism and the struggle for global equality, the struggles against global inequalities and for justice, equality in the world. And I think that there are signs that people in various parts of the world understand how we must come together to challenge economic inequality. Capitalism is more powerful today than ever before. I have been a communist practically all of my life, but I don't know whether I could have imagined when I was a young person standing up against capitalism, you know, looking toward Cuba as the hope for the future. I don't know whether I could have ever understood the extent to which capitalism would determine the lives of people everywhere. But this is all the more reason why we have to keep the critique of capitalism alive and to understand the way in which it exaggerates and exacerbates racism and women's inequality.
Você acha que hoje Cuba tem uma relação já resolvida com relação ao racismo? Você acha que hoje Cuba poderia ser um exemplo de uma sociedade igualitária?
Well, of course, racism is very complex, and I would never assume to suggest that anywhere in the world the problem of racism has been solved. In the US, the assumption is that racism was dismantled with the triumph of the civil rights movement. Here in Brazil, there has been talk about racial democracy for who knows how long, but we understand that racism continues to affect the social, economic, and political structures. In Cuba, Cuba has gone a long way toward disestablishing those structural inequalities that are brought about by racism. That is to say, in terms of jobs, in terms of housing, in terms of health care, in terms of access to the university. Cuba has gone a long way, but I'm sure there are many, many more challenges there. But I do think that we can be inspired by those efforts to eradicate structural racism, because unfortunately, most people assume that racism is about individual utterances, individual attitudes. People get very upset about the use of certain words that are racist, but they don't get upset about the fact that a disproportionate number of black people are behind bars and a disproportionate number of black people on the other side have access to the university. So race really matters when it comes to determining who gets to get an education and who gets to spend their lives behind bars.
Bem, nós ouvimos a ministra da Secretaria de Políticas de Promoção da Igualdade Social, Luísa Barros. Ela nos enviou uma pergunta, vamos ouvir.
Ângela, desde que nós nos encontramos pela primeira vez no final dos anos 90, você tem vindo ao Brasil mais ou menos regularmente, já nos encontramos outras vezes em atividades na Bahia, onde existe uma relação bastante forte sua com vários grupos de combate ao racismo. Ao longo desse tempo, o que você identifica como sendo as principais mudanças na política racial brasileira?
Well, of course, I have been fortunate enough to have spent some time in Brazil over the last decade and a half. And what I've been most impressed by has been the impact of affirmative action. In the US, of course, affirmative action has been under attack for the last 2 decades. And if one looks at some of the major public universities in the state where I live, the state of California, the percentage of black students has declined over the last period. On the other hand, here in Brazil, I've watched the creation of a new university in Bahia, and I participated a year and a half ago, I believe, in Black Solidarity Day in Reconcova and in the campus in Cruz das Almas. And I was totally impressed by the fact that 80% of the students are of African descent there. I wish the U.S. could embrace a strategy that allows us to move so rapidly. But of course, as I was saying before, racism is very complex and many changes remain to be made.
Voltando pouco, uma pessoa que foi durante 20 anos membro do Partido Comunista e que foi uma coisa importante na vida de muitas gerações, a senhora lamentou o fim do comunismo? Lamentou a derrocada da União Soviética, da Alemanha? Como é que a senhora acompanhou esse processo?
Yes, it was a sad occasion to see the dismantling of socialism in the countries in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. Although we understand that there were major problems that existing socialism had not solved. Perhaps there were major inroads with respect to economic democracy, but political democracy had not been created. And therefore, the lessons were not that socialism is no longer a valid aspiration, but that we must be as attentive to other modes of democracy as we are to economic democracy. And as a matter of fact, I was a member of the Communist Party at that time, and we took that, some of us took that, as a sign that we needed to try to democratize the internal structure of the Communist Party. Unfortunately, it didn't happen at that time, and many of us left the Communist Party and created another organization that is called Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. But I continue to do work with the Communist Party of the US today. We have very cordial relations because I think that people have recognized that we need to take seriously the problematic aspects of existing socialism at that time without assuming that it is all right to declare the triumph of capitalism and to toss aspirations for socialism into the garbage can. I'm still as much a communist now as I was then, I think.
Você falava sobre os símbolos da persistência desse racismo estrutural presentes na sociedade norte-americana. Você considera que a pena de morte, por exemplo, é um desses símbolos persistentes? Como e quais os outros demonstrações do racismo estruturando a sociedade norte-americana hoje?
I could talk about many examples. I could talk about the healthcare system and the privatization of healthcare and the impact, the disproportionate impact this has had on Black communities, Latino communities, and other communities of color. But as you pointed out, the persistence of capital punishment is perhaps the most dramatic example of the way in which the inheritances of slavery continue to plague the U.S. 150 years after the putative abolition of slavery. As I've often pointed out, there was discussion about the need to abolish the death penalty around the time of the American Revolution. We're talking about the end of the 1700s. And in most places, it was abolished except for murder, for white people. But it was retained as a punishment for slaves. And this is why the institution itself survived and moved into the mainstream in the aftermath of the abolition of slavery. And so when one wonders why, of all the industrialized democracies in the world, the US is the only country that uses capital punishment as a routine mode of punishment, the only answer is racism, the inheritances of slavery. And now, of course, the debates are about humane modes of death. Is it better to kill someone with this chemical or that chemical? And of course, that is absolutely ridiculous.
Você poderia esclarecer o nosso público, porque de vez em quando a gente vê que um homem branco também vai para a pena de morte. Então a ideia de que é uma coisa contra, que é uma herança da escravidão, muitas vezes fica complicada por causa disso. Se você explicasse um pouco a diferença, os tratamentos, por que a gente pode achar que é uma continuidade, né, que a necessidade de abolir isso tem a ver com a escravidão, a importância, o número de negros que são muito mais condenados, um pouco a dificuldade que eles têm de acesso a uma defesa justa, como é que seria isso assim?
First of all, white people can also be victims of racism. And so when I talk about the death penalty, capital punishment, as a racist apparatus, I'm not only talking about the people, the bodies of the people whom it affects. I'm talking about the structure itself. So when a white person is put to death, that person is just as much a victim of a racist machine okay. as a black person. So I think it's very important to point that out because we're so accustomed to thinking about racism only as individual acts against individual bodies. And I think we need to talk about the structural character of racism. I was recently in South Africa, where there continues to be discussion about the miners who were killed in Americana. Some 30 black miners were shot by black police under the direction of black women police commissioners. And the question is whether one can still say that that police apparatus is racist, even though all of the characters are black. And I think one has to talk about the inheritances of apartheid, the memories of apartheid that are still deeply embedded in that structure. And so I would say the same thing of police departments.
Nós temos isso aqui também, quer dizer, a polícia brasileira é violenta, e se você for olhar a cor da pele das pessoas, muitas vezes são policiais negros assassinando garotos negros.
Aqui no Brasil, recentemente, no ano passado, um trabalhador negro chamado Amarildo foi preso numa favela, na favela da Rocinha, tudo gravado por câmeras instaladas na própria comunidade, e desapareceu. Desapareceram com o Amarildo. E acabou ficando um símbolo da luta contra esse verdadeiro apartheid que existe na sociedade brasileira. O Amarildo é mais um dos milhares de brasileiros negros que são presos e desaparecem sem um motivo, sem uma razão, apenas por serem negros. Recentemente, a nossa equipe de TV esteve fazendo uma entrevista com a mulher do Amarildo, e os policiais, em determinado momento, chegaram próximo à viatura da TV Brasil e perguntaram para o motorista o que eles estavam fazendo ali. Aquela mulher não tinha mais nada a dizer. Ou seja, há um cerceamento até da comunicação do que se passa dentro dessa periferia. Como é que o senhor acha que a gente vai conseguir virar essa página e acabar definitivamente com essa violência contra os negros brasileiros?
I think we have to. I don't think we can assume that this will be the way of the future. And that means that each time there is such an incident where a black person is brutalized or murdered or disappeared by the police, we have to speak up. But we cannot assume that it's only about individual cases. And I think that's a problem that we face. In the U.S., all over Europe and Brazil, we focus on the individual cases which we should. We should, of course, focus on those individual cases. But we should recognize that they happen because of the racism that's within the institution. So simply by prosecuting the one policeman who is involved in brutalizing or murdering a black person, we're not going to solve the problem of the continuation, the perpetuation of racism through police forces. So we have to change the way police forces work, just as we have to change the role of the prison. Some people think this is too idealistic, but the imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment has not always been with us. It is an invented punishment. And if it came into being in history, it can go out of being, can go out of existence in history. So I think it really is important to have what I would call an abolitionist perspective to these issues.
Bem, vamos fazer um rápido intervalo. Nós voltamos em instantes entrevistando Angela Daivis. Por ser um programa gravado, nós pedimos para que as pessoas enviassem suas perguntas antes. Não saia daí! O Espaço Público está de volta e hoje conversa com a professora e militante Angela Daivis. Lembrando que hoje o programa é gravado e não haverá participação ao vivo para as redes sociais. Antes de prosseguir nosso debate, vamos relembrar um pouco da luta contra o racismo nos Estados Unidos.
Ao lado do Brasil, os Estados Unidos foram um dos maiores destinos de navios negreiros, que trouxeram mão de obra cativa da África. A escravidão alimentou a economia americana por mais de 2 séculos e só foi abolida após uma guerra civil na qual morreram mais de 600 mil pessoas. Apesar da abolição, o racismo sobreviveu como uma herança duradoura e profunda. A discriminação foi definida em lei e a violência contra os negros era tolerada pelas autoridades. Inconformados com o fim do cativeiro, em diversos estados do Sul, nasceram braços da Ku Klux Klan, organização terrorista que sequestrava, torturava e assassinava cidadãos negros. Pregando a superioridade do homem branco, o grupo se manteve até as vésperas da Segunda Guerra Mundial, quando o esforço para vencer o nazismo e reconstruir um país destruído na Grande Depressão abriu a porta das Forças Armadas e das grandes empresas a trabalhadores negros. A luta contra a segregação ganhou força na década de 1950, quando homens e mulheres desafiavam leis que proibiam negros frequentar os mesmos bares, restaurantes e escolas que brancos. Um episódio que fez história no estado de Alabama, a costureira Rosa Parks se recusou a dar seu lugar no ônibus para uma pessoa branca, atitude que levaria a um boicote às empresas locais de ônibus. A luta pelos direitos civis produziu lideranças importantes, como o pastor luterano Martin Luther King, que recebeu o Prêmio Nobel da Paz em 1964, depois de organizar marchas e protestos pacíficos sem paralelo na história dos Estados Unidos. Outra liderança, só que mais radical, foi Malcolm X, e na década de 60 que tanto ele quanto Martin Luther King foram assassinados. Protestos violentos surgiram em várias cidades, mostrando que a população negra não aceitaria passivamente qualquer iniciativa para diminuir direitos recém-conquistados no governo John Kennedy. Embora estejam longe de levar a mesma vida de conforto e oportunidades da sociedade branca, os negros conquistaram nos últimos anos novos espaços na economia, na cultura, nas universidades e na política. Em 1967, um antigo advogado ligado aos direitos civis, Thurgood Marshall, tornou-se o primeiro negro a ocupar uma vaga na Suprema Corte dos Estados Unidos. Em 2009, Barack Obama tomou posse como o primeiro presidente negro da história americana.
Ângela, uma boa parte das pessoas que nos enviaram perguntas pelas redes sociais perguntam sobre os Panteras Negras. Perguntam sobre sua participação nos Panteras Negras, se você foi militante dos Panteras Negras. A maioria das pessoas acredita de alguma forma você participou desse movimento que durou uma certa época e foi uma coisa importante, né? Eu gostei, acho que é uma boa oportunidade de você esclarecer tudo isso aqui para todas as pessoas.
Well, yeah, it's somewhat complicated. First of all, I should say that I have supported and defended the Black Panther Party from the very outset. I was studying in Europe when the Black Panther Party was founded, and it was because I heard about this new moment in the development of the struggle for Black liberation that I returned to the States. I actually was a member of the Black Panther Party in 1967, 68. I worked with one of the offices in Los Angeles. I was in charge of political education and did quite a lot of work with the Black Panther Party. However, I was a member of the Communist Party at the same time. This is actually, I'm realizing now, it was 68 in 1968, because I joined the Communist Party in 1968. And I was also a member of the Black Panther Party. And those who were higher up in the leadership structure of the Black Panther Party decided that people could not be members of two parties. So I had to choose, would I remain a member of the Black Panther Party, or would I remain a member of the Communist Party? And I chose the Communist Party, but I continue to have cordial relationships with the Black Panther Party and worked with that organization until its demise.
Dizem que é de pequeno que se forma o caráter do homem. Você acha que as escolas hoje e a sociedade de maneira geral está conseguindo fazer esse ensinamento Eu lembro que na campanha passada da reeleição de Barack Obama, um dos candidatos usou um slogan na camiseta falando: vamos colocar um branco de novo na Casa Branca. Isso não é um mau exemplo?
Well, first of all, I do think that education can make a difference. I grew up in a family where both my mother and father were educators, so I was exposed to education at a very early age. And I know that it was that education that allowed me to imagine a different world, even as I was forced to live in a world of violence and racial segregation. I always point out that my mother used to say, this is not the way things are supposed to be. Things will be different one day. And I think that is the role that education should play. It should play the role of encouraging people to imagine themselves in the future, imagine themselves differently. And of course, when Barack Obama was elected, it was interesting that most people said, I never imagined that this would happen in my lifetime. The campaign was extremely racist, and you're absolutely right. People talked about putting a white man in the White House, or put the white back into the White House. But when Barack Obama was elected, it was only one black man in the White House, and a black prisoner said at that time, there may be one black man in the White House, but there are 1 million black men in the big house, which is the prison, of course. But getting back to education, I think that the role that education currently plays in the US, at least, is very negative, because schools have become places where there are metal detectors and oftentimes policemen and guards that are armed. And so young black children of color, learn where they're supposed to be educated. They're not being educated, and they learn how to be treated as prisoners. They learn discipline, rather than acquiring knowledge. And they learn to have their imaginations stifled, as opposed to learning how to imagine themselves in the future in a world that is less riddled with racism and violence.
Angela, durante o Festival Latinidades, a socióloga norte-americana Patricia Hill Collins falou que nesse ambiente escolar o ativismo, a iniciativa das crianças e das crianças negras tem sido podado desde o início. Você observa essa dinâmica acontecendo no ambiente escolar e também fora dele, uma criminalização dos movimentos sociais e também das formas de protesto das pessoas que se engajam nesses protestos de rua. Você observa que isso tem ocorrido?
Well, it certainly has been happening in the U.S. The criminalization of political resistance goes, all the way back to it goes back to W.E.B. Du Bois, who spent time in jail. One can talk about Martin Luther King and his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, the 50th anniversary of which we celebrated last year. One can look at the imprisoning of Native American, indigenous activists. And so the message that sends to young people is that if you get out of line, if you challenge the status quo, if you stand up for justice, you're going to be punished. And this is why I think 40 years ago, the campaign around my case was so important, because even though the most powerful forces in the U.S., we're talking about Richard Nixon, who was president, and Ronald Reagan, who was the governor, and J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI, they were all determined to have me sentenced to death. And people said no. People stood up all around the world. And that was an important victory. So I don't think people should be afraid to engage in activism, but they should recognize that it's about building communities. It's not about an individual standing up. It's about creating communities of resistance, communities of struggle. And if we are attacked, if we are criminalized, we fight back, and eventually we win.
A senhora pensa que esses movimentos de resistência eram mais fortes há 40 anos? Porque eles conseguiram vitórias que hoje parecem difíceis de igualar. Né? Quer dizer, prisioneiros ficam presos e cumprem pena de prisão. Né? Tem casos nos Estados Unidos que, assim, ou seja, existe os movimentos sociais perderam força? Ou estão sem direção? Como é que a gente vê aí? Como é que a gente pode pensar? Existe uma crise nesse movimento social?
Well, of course, conditions were very different 40 years ago. There was this palpable sense of the possibility of a victory over capitalism. People felt connected across geopolitical boundaries. But also, there were things we didn't know 40 years ago. In a sense, things were a lot easier because we didn't understand the complexity of struggles against racism, for example. And I often point out that many of us thought that to challenge racism, we were calling for freedom for the black man. And we did call for freedom for the black man. And it was only later that we realized that we had left women out of the whole picture. And so in order to deal with racism, we also had to deal with sexism. And so struggles became more complicated. We began to talk about intersectionality, the relation between race, class, sex, issues of sexuality, issues of gender aren't so clear as they were before, because we have to recognize that there are people who don't necessarily identify as male or female. There are people who identify as trans, people who identify as gender non-conforming, and we have to take all of these things into consideration. We know now that we have to consider settler colonialism. Wherever it is, settler colonialism as it emerged in the U.S., but settler colonialism in occupied Palestine, because Israel is really the only settler colonial state that continues to try to expand in the 21st century. And so the question is, how do we attend to all of these complicated issues, and how do we understand the connections and interlinkages? So I think that now we are in a much better place, a much better position to build movements that will bring about lasting change than we were 40 years ago. We may have experienced victories more easily 40 years ago, but now we have the consciousness, the awareness, and we have the technological tools. Oftentimes we allow the new modes of communication to control us, rather than using them as technologies to bring together communities, all over the world. So I'm actually quite excited about possibilities today.
Agora, eu podia fazer uma pergunta. Nós ouvimos a cientista social e diretora do Instituto de Pesquisas e Estudos Afro-Brasileiros, Elisa Larkin Nascimento, viúva do professor Abdias do Nascimento, que foi um dos pioneiros da luta contra o racismo no Brasil. Elisa nos enviou uma pergunta, vamos ouvir.
Angela Daivis, saudações, é um prazer poder dizer da nossa solidariedade de muitas décadas. Eu e meu marido, Abdias Nascimento, estivemos com você em Durban em 2001, durante a 3ª Conferência Mundial contra o Racismo. E, partindo daí, eu gostaria de lhe perguntar como ver a situação do racismo hoje nos Estados Unidos, país que, um pouco parecido com o Brasil, que se diz não racista por causa da miscigenação, hoje tem um presidente negro, né? Fica uma situação, aquela negação do racismo. Como você vê hoje a existência do racismo contra a população negra nos Estados Unidos e no mundo?
Yes, it is true that with the election of Barack Obama, many people assume that we were entering into a new phase, what has often been called a post-racial phase. But we've recognized that the impact of racism is perhaps stronger now than before. And as I was saying in a previous conversation, we have to understand the structural power of racism. It is not simply the racist attitudes that continue to persist and will persist as long as racism is a powerful social, economic, and political force. There is the case of Donald Sterling, who was the owner of the basketball team, the Los Angeles Clippers, and he made some racist comments in private, which of course were spread all over the world, and he has been forced to sell his team. Now, I'm not saying that he shouldn't be held accountable, but that is not the racism that we should be so concerned about. We should be concerned about the racism that does really major damage to human beings, you know, all over the country. Now, we are in a situation where there are more black people in power, and black people who have a visibility in movies, on television, as heads of corporations. That often conveys the impression that things have changed substantively. But we see black people in positions of power engaging in the same strategies that white people used, and so nothing has changed. It's just that the bodies of a few people have changed, and that is not a way to imagine the end of racism. You know, everyone, black people and people of color, moving up the economic and political hierarchy. We have to change the whole system, and that is the challenge facing us today.
Eu queria retomar aquela questão do capitalismo que a senhora estava falando agora há pouco. A senhora participou do movimento Ocupa Wall Street e a gente vê atualmente uma crise mundial do capitalismo, principalmente na Europa. Os Estados Unidos acabou de passar por uma grande crise e parece que o poder do dinheiro, dos mercados, continuam determinando o futuro do planeta. Eu queria saber a sua posição com relação ao conflito no Oriente Médio. Quando que o mundo vai conseguir realmente pacificar aquela região e dar o direito aos palestinos de terem a sua nação?
Okay, yeah, two questions. One, the rise of global capitalism, and two, the situation in occupied Palestine, the Israel-Palestine issue. First, I think it's really important to thank those who participated in the Occupy movement. Because the Occupy movement made it possible for us to engage in open critique of capitalism for the first time, perhaps, since the 1930s. And therefore, the anti-capitalist consciousness of not only in the U.S., but in other parts of the world where the Occupy movement arose is much greater. With respect to the situation in the Middle East and you know, what many people are calling, what the United Nations has called Israeli apartheid. I am really troubled by the failure of progressive people all over the world to turn towards Palestine and to say, no, this should not be happening. Human beings should not be treated in that way. Many people are afraid that if they endorse the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement called for by Palestinian civil society, that they will be charged with anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism has nothing to do with supporting the struggles for freedom of the Palestinian people. As a matter of fact, so many, especially young Israeli Jews, are standing up against the Israeli state, just as we in the U.S. stand up against the U.S. state, even when Barack Obama is president. And so now, of course, we see the horrendous violence that is being visited upon people in Gaza, the children who are being killed. I think that black people have a special responsibility because we're looking at the inheritances of racism. We're looking at the technologies of racism that the state of Israel uses. We're looking at a connection between the prison industrial complex in the U.S. That incarcerates vast numbers of black people, and the creation of a situation in Palestine that looks like prison, even when people are supposedly living in the free world. Palestine, Gaza especially, as it has been pointed out, is the largest open-air prison in the world. So I think we should understand those connections.
Agora vamos fazer um breve intervalo e voltamos em instantes com a entrevista com Angela Daivis. Até já. Estamos de volta com o Espaço Público, que hoje discute a discriminação racial e a situação carcerária no Brasil e no mundo, com Angela Daivis. Nós ouvimos a advogada e militante do movimento negro, Ana Luísa Flausina. Ela nos enviou uma pergunta. Vamos ouvir.
Eu queria saber da relação entre encarceramento e resistência negra, né? A gente sabe que há um grande movimento encarcerador para coibir resistência negra, que eu queria saber se a falta de uma resistência negra mais efetiva, como isso impacta esse grande movimento encarcerador e como a gente pode forjar e adensar movimentos de colaboração de resistência negra na diáspora para tentar vetar essas faces genocidas, né? Que nos Estados Unidos a gente sabe que tem esse projeto do encarceramento de forma monumental e aqui no Brasil tem os extermínios da juventude negra como sua face mais bem acabada.
It's true that the strategy of mass incarceration in the U.S. that has led to the imprisonment of vast numbers of people, especially from black communities, communities of color. There are something like 1.5 million people incarcerated in the U.S. It's the highest rate of imprisonment in the world, the highest absolute numbers of people in prison in the world. In order to understand this, one has to perhaps revisit the workings of capitalism and the extent to which incarceration has become profitable. That is to say, not only the rise of private prison corporations all over the world, but also the outsourcing of various tasks within the prison to private corporations. So this means that there are people who have a stake in maintaining large numbers of people in prison. And this has nothing to do with security. This has nothing to do with addressing issues of crime. Now, we know that there's a disproportionate number of black people behind bars, not because black people are disproportionately engaging in criminal activity. What we have is a disproportionate rate of surveillance. Communities, Black communities, Latino communities, poor communities, communities of color, as is the case in Brazil, are subject to high rates of surveillance. That is to say, there's a police presence there. In middle-class white communities, there's a very small police presence. And so young people engage in some of the same kinds of activities, especially with respect to drug use and drug trafficking, but they're never identified. So I think it's important to recognize how racism functions through these apparatuses. Now, the rise of global capitalism at the same time as we witness the emergence of a prison industrial complex means that these high rates of incarceration have a great deal to do with the functioning of the capitalist system. And I think that if we are going to effectively challenge mass incarceration, we have to take on capitalism as well. And we have to recognize how the prison has become the face of US democracy all over the world. So we're not only talking about vast numbers of facilities inside the US, we're talking about Guantanamo. And of course, Obama was supposed to close down Guantanamo. That's one of the reasons I voted for him. And Guantanamo still exists. We're talking about all of the secret prisons, the Abu Ghraibs, and we're talking about connections with prisons in South Africa, with prisons in Brazil, with prisons in Colombia. Prisons are used as a false solution to severe social problems. So instead of solving the problem of poverty, instead of solving the problem of health care, as a matter of fact, the two largest psychiatric institutions in the US are jails. And in Chicago and in New York, there are vast numbers of people who have psychiatric problems who are in prison because we have no other means of addressing those issues, no means of addressing poverty. And so I think that question is really important because it means that the campaign against the use of prisons is a campaign for social equality, is a campaign for justice, is a campaign against capitalism, is a campaign for women's equality. They're all connected.
Agora, Ângela, você propõe a extinção dos presídios. De qualquer maneira, a pessoa quando comete um crime, às vezes um crime bárbaro, um crime hediondo, ela tem que ser punida, ela tem que pagar pelo crime que cometeu e ser ressocializada para voltar à comunidade. Se acabam os presídios, que eu concordo até que virou um depósito de pessoas, como fazer com os criminosos? Por exemplo, no ano passado, um jovem negro, o Trayvon Martin, foi covardemente assassinado. O que fazer com o assassino dele?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I totally agree with you that people who engage in those antisocial acts, who commit acts of harm against other people, should be held accountable. But that does not mean that they should simply be punished. Because if they are simply punished, often what happens is they come out of the process worse than they were when they went into prison. So prisons help to reproduce that violence, reproduce those antisocial acts. The question we should ask is, how can we transform society? How can we address these issues of violence in such a way as the individual who has committed them comes out with a better perspective on life, comes out not angry and not wanting to commit acts of violence again, but comes out of the process, wanting to contribute to society. I totally believe in rehabilitation, but I don't think it can happen in prison. And that is why we have to imagine other ways of making people accountable for the crimes that they commit. And then we have to recognize that many people are in prison not because they committed crimes, but because they're black, because they're young, because they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The question of Trayvon Martin, the vigilante, I think that we have to talk about vigilante racist violence as well as police racist violence. Now, what if he had been convicted and sent to prison for many years? And many people wanted that, and they were very angry. And of course, I was angry. We were all angry when George Zimmerman's trial ended in the way it did. But I had to check my own emotions because I think that our emotions are primed to reproduce the impulse of the state. And the state says that when someone does something harmful or wrong, then that person should be subject to harm, or that person should be subject to violence. Had he been sent to prison for many years, what difference would that have made? Would that have changed the whole history of racist violence? With the case of Trayvon Martin, it wasn't only about that individual. We were concerned about him, not just because he as an individual was the target of that violence, but because it represented a long history of racist violence committed by slaveholders, committed by the police. And the question is, how are we going to stop that? And I don't think prisons can help us in that process.
Ângela, você tem sido uma crítica das políticas de combate à violência doméstica. Como garantir uma proteção para as mulheres de uma outra forma que não seja essa criminalização dos agressores?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really great question. Yes, I have joined those who see that simply criminalizing domestic violence does not eradicate it. I'm concerned with people who are the targets of intimate violence, and I'm concerned with the fact that it is the most widespread violence in the world. It is the mode of violence that exists almost everywhere in the world. And even in those countries that have succeeded in criminalizing domestic violence, the rate of violence against women, of gender violence, has not decreased. So something is wrong. We can't just keep sending people to prison, which allows us to forget about the problem. And this is why I'm critical of the use of the prison as a solution, because it in a way allows us to absolve ourselves of the responsibility of trying to figure out how to purge this world of this horrible violence directed largely against women. Now, many places have figured out alternatives to relying on law enforcement. They have to do with restorative justice approaches. They have to do with sometimes shaming. And certainly, an abolitionist perspective does not indicate that the person who commits this violence should not be held accountable. And that is in many ways, it's harder for people to confront the person they have abused and to figure out how he or she is going to make amends than it is to go to prison. It's easy to go to prison and spend that time there. It's much harder to recognize in oneself where that violence comes from and how are we going to eradicate it on a planetary scale.
Eu queria fazer uma pergunta. Se eu estou entendendo muito a senhora, ninguém sabe, tem certezas absolutas a respeito de muitas coisas. Ninguém tem aquela certeza sobre como deve ser o futuro para todas as pessoas. Mas pelo que eu estou vendo é que a senhora é cada vez mais convencida que a liberdade é sempre um melhor remédio do que a prisão. Que a perda da liberdade não educa ninguém. Que mesmo as pessoas assim, entre duas, a liberdade é melhor. É essa a ideia que está animando a senhora hoje em dia?
Yes, but also I'm concerned about how to purge our societies of the problems that prisons cannot address. And it seems to me that if you're really interested in getting rid of violence as it happens in the world, as it happens on an institutional level, as it happens on an intimate level, then we would have to begin to imagine many different solutions. There's not, the prison is one solution fits all, and that does not work. And so I think that we need to begin to devise some imaginative and creative solutions that does not involve torturing people and subjecting people to violence and turning them into worse human beings than they ever were when they entered prison.
Daqui a pouco nós voltaremos para o último bloco na nossa entrevista com Angela Daivis. Não saia daí. Estamos de volta com o Espaço Público, que hoje discute segregação, racismo e feminismo com Angela Daivis. Nós ouvimos a escritora moçambicana Paulina Chiziane, que nos enviou uma pergunta. Vamos ouvir.
Gostaria de dizer a Angela o quanto lhe admiro e gostaria também de saber onde fica o centro da sua força. Essa força com que luta pelos direitos dos negros, tanto na diáspora, assim como em África. E eu cresci no colonialismo português e conheci também alguma coisa sobre a libertação da mulher a partir dos seus discursos.
Well, thank you very much for the question, and I enjoyed hearing your intervention yesterday. Where do I find my strength? I suppose I would say that it comes from my communities, the people with whom I work, my sense of connectedness with people who are engaged in struggles for justice and equality. You know, I often tell a story that comes from the time when I was incarcerated. I was picked up by the FBI and transported to this jail in New York where they kept me incommunicado. I was not able to talk to anyone. They put me in the section of the jail that was reserved for people with psychiatric problems. And I lay there in the cell feeling totally alone. And suddenly I heard these faint voices, and I could hardly make out what they were saying. And then I realized they were saying, "Free Angela Davis." And it was people who had gathered outside of the jail late at night who were, even before the campaign for my freedom was organized, who came forward. And that made me feel like I wasn't alone. And so I carry those memories and the sense of being connected with people, recognizing that whatever problems I have suffered, they cannot begin to compare to people who have spent lifetimes in prison, to people in Palestine, to people who have struggled, for their freedom in so many ways. And so, I get a lot of my strength from young people, because I continue to do work with activists And I find that activists get younger and younger, and I get older and older. But I think that's good. Intergenerational work is so important. And I recognize that young people are willing to take more risk than those of us who are older, because we're sometimes a little too wise. And so I learned how to follow the leadership of young people. I've learned a great deal from young people, whether activists or my students. And I also realize now that I've gotten older how important self-care is. And I've learned from young people that in movements where you're constantly working against something, you have to be able to renew yourself. You have to be able to find ways of recovering. And so whereas 40 years ago, if someone had told me, oh, you should do yoga, I would have said, what? Now I practice yoga every day, and I meditate, and I think it's important to bring all of those things into our communities, into our collectives, so that people can stay involved for the long run, because it's not going to be solved in a few years. It hasn't been solved in the more than 50, no, I should say now, more than a half century that I've been involved. And who knows how long it's going to take. And so we have to be willing to steel ourselves for the long run and recognize that we're creating legacies. It may not happen in our lifetimes, but we can pass the legacies on to people who will take up the flag and continue.
Angela, nesse contexto de renovação, como fortalecer os laços entre as mulheres da diáspora, as mulheres da diáspora com as mulheres africanas? Ano que vem, o movimento de mulheres negras aqui no Brasil vai realizar uma grande marcha. Como é possível fortalecer esses laços e qual é a agenda que as mulheres negras da diáspora e junto com as mulheres africanas precisam enfrentar?
First of all, I am deeply grateful to Black women in Brazil who I think are carrying on the legacies of Black feminism. And the Latinidades 2014 conference was so remarkable in bringing together Brazilian women, Afro-descended Brazilian women, or Black Brazilian women. I sometimes like to use Black because I think it's more all-embracing, and it's a political identity rather than simply a racial identity. And I am so happy to hear that there will be this march in 2015, and hopefully people from all over the world will join in. I certainly think that we in the United States should express solidarity with and take leadership from our sisters in Brazil.
Eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta do Luiz Leão pelo Twitter. Ele pergunta qual o cenário que a senhora enxerga para os direitos das mulheres nos Estados Unidos e no mundo. Eu pergunto, acrescentando, qual a importância do feminismo que a senhora vê no seu horizonte político, na luta política?
Well, I have come to the conclusion over the last period that feminism is absolutely central to our strategies for justice and equality. And feminism, not only because it addresses women's rights, and of course women's rights are extremely important, but also because feminism, and especially Black feminism, women of color feminism, helps us understand the interconnectedness of issues. And that is, I think, what we need now more than ever before. We need to recognize that women will never achieve equality if we don't also consider how to prevent the damage that is being done to the environment. And so the question of environmental justice and food sovereignty, that is another issue that we need to take up, particularly with Monsanto colonizing the entire world with and the kind of capitalist industrial food production that is making people sick. I'm extremely devastated when I come to Brazil and see a McDonald's because it says to me that that disease that is being perpetrated by capitalist corporations that are only interested in making money and not in nourishing people and not in serving the needs of people who need to eat. And so I'm excited about the way in which feminism can be used by everyone. It's not about people of a certain gender. It's not about people addressing a certain set of issues. It is about anyone who has a progressive vision of the future, understanding the interconnectedness of all of the issues that affect us.
Atualmente, no planeta, nós temos algumas mulheres no comando dos países. Aqui na América Latina, nós temos 3 mulheres governando 3 países. Temos uma mulher na Europa. Como é que a senhora vê a atuação dessas mulheres no poder? Houve uma modificação no rumo do capitalismo? E a senhora acha que agora é a hora, depois de um negro, dos Estados Unidos ter uma mulher na presidência da República?
I think it's good that women have been elected to political office in South America, in Europe. Just as I think it's good that a black man has been elected to political office in the US. But I don't know whether that solves our problems. And I don't know whether if we simply focus on changing the faces of those who are at the very top of the hierarchies, whether political or economic, that is going to change conditions at the base. So I've often said that when Obama was running for office, had there been someone of another racial identity running who had a more radical agenda, I would have certainly, voted for him. I would much prefer a white candidate who, calls for a critique of capitalism and an end to racism and an end to prisons than I would be for a black candidate who is for the status quo. So I think it's about politics. And if we can get out of the habit of assuming that one change in one body is going to create radical transformation, then I think we would recognize that we have to build mass movements. We have to create change at the bottom, at the very base.
Como você vê, Ângelo, o papel da mídia nesse contexto? Basta democratizar o acesso? É preciso que haja uma mudança mesmo na forma, no discurso da mídia, especialmente sobre a população negra, para mexer nas estruturas do racismo?
Aliás, só complementando, aqui no Brasil, a grande imprensa, de maneira geral, é contra as cotas. E quase todo dia sai alguma notícia criticando a distribuição de cotas, tanto nas universidades como no serviço público.
Yes, I think the media can play an important role in transforming the way people think, in transforming our ways of imagining the world. And of course, with social media, we're now confronted with the vast influence of ideas that are communicated instantaneously. And I know that in the U.S., the established media continues to promote, certain regressive ideas. The notion of quotas. And I take issue with the very, use of that term, quotas, because I don't think affirmative action is about quotas. It's not about quotas. And when we call it quotas, as the media often do, that conveys the impression that we are pitting individuals against individuals, when actually it's about trying to begin the process of undoing what has long, a process that has a very long history. Affirmative action is often represented as a white man against, say a black woman. But when one recognizes that affirmative action designed to change the population of jobs, of universities, is not only about individuals, it's about communities. It's about allowing communities to rise, and individuals benefit, yes. But I think that we have to begin to change that way of representing affirmative action as simply being white people against black people. It's about changing the world. It's about justice. It's about equality.
Bem, queria dizer que acho que estamos todos muito felizes com essa entrevista. Foi uma oportunidade, um grande aprendizado de todos nós. Agradecemos mais uma vez a sua presença aqui. Agradecemos a jornalista Juliana César Nunes e também o jornalista Florestan Fernandes Júnior. Mas eu agradeço especialmente a você por ter nos acompanhado até aqui. Para saber mais sobre o nosso programa, entre no site da TV Brasil. E desde já, eu convido você para um novo encontro aqui, na próxima terça-feira, às 10 da noite, com mais um programa Espaço Público. Até lá!